During the reading of my dad's will, my sister said, "I'm getting the house and the business. She just gets the dolls." Everyone laughed, until the lawyer said, "Actually, the company was never in her name. It was in." I just couldn't stop laughing at her. My name is Sarah, and this is about how my older sister Jessica learned that karma has a wicked sense of humor. Growing up, Jessica was always Dad's golden child. She was 5 years older than me, captain of the cheerleading squad, homecoming queen, and everything came easily to her. Meanwhile, I was the awkward younger sister who preferred books to parties and spent most of my childhood playing with my extensive doll collection. Dad owned Mitchell and Associates Construction, a company he'd built from the ground up after immigrating from Ireland in the 70s. Jessica always assumed she'd inherit it all. The favoritism was obvious from day one. When Jessica turned 16, Dad bought her a brand new Honda Civic. When I turned 16, I got a used bicycle from a garage sale. Jessica got her college tuition paid in full to study business administration at Northwestern. I worked 3 part-time jobs to afford community college, where I studied accounting. Jessica moved back home after graduation and was immediately given a management position at the company. I moved to Chicago and worked my way up from junior accountant to senior financial analyst at a mid-sized firm. But here's the thing nobody knew about me and Dad: we had our own secret relationship. Every Sunday for the past 12 years, since I moved to Chicago, Dad would drive the hour and a half to visit me. We'd spend the afternoon at antique shops, searching for vintage dolls to add to my collection. Dad understood my passion in a way nobody else did. He'd grown up poor in Dublin, and his mother had sewn him a single cloth doll that he treasured throughout his childhood. He understood that my dolls weren't just toys, they were art, history, and memories all wrapped up in porcelain and fabric. During these Sunday visits, Dad would also confide in me about the business. He'd tell me about Jessica's mistakes, how she'd overspent on a project by $40,000, how she'd missed a crucial deadline that cost them a major client, how she'd accidentally violated EPA regulations in 2020 and nearly gotten them shut down. But every time, Dad would bail her out, fix her mistakes, and never let anyone else know what had happened. "Sarah," he'd say, stirring his coffee in my little kitchen, "your sister has the charisma to run a company, but she doesn't have the discipline. You have the discipline, but you've never wanted the spotlight." I thought these conversations were just Dad venting his frustrations. I never imagined there was a bigger plan in motion. The Sunday visits continued right up until Dad's massive heart attack 6 months ago. Jessica called me from the hospital, sobbing into the phone about how sudden it had been. Dad had been at the office late, working on a big bid, when it happened. The janitor found him the next morning. At the funeral, Jessica played the grieving daughter perfectly. She stood at the podium in her black Armani dress, talking about how Dad had taught her everything about running a business, how she was going to honor his legacy by expanding Mitchell and Associates into the biggest construction company in the state. Everyone nodded and murmured their approval. Jessica had always been the heir apparent, after all. I sat in the back row, holding the small cloth doll Dad had given me on my 13th birthday, a replica of the one his mother had made him. I didn't speak at the service. What could I say that hadn't already been said? The weeks following the funeral were a blur of legal meetings and paperwork. Dad's lawyer, Mr. Richardson, kept scheduling appointments that Jessica would attend while I stayed in Chicago, trying to keep my own life together. Jessica would call me afterward, updating me on the progress of settling the estate. "It's all pretty straightforward," she'd say, her voice already taking on that executive tone she'd been practicing. "Dad left the house and the business to me, obviously. There are some small bequests to various charities, and he left you your doll collection and a small cash inheritance. Nothing too complicated." I wasn't surprised. This was exactly what I'd expected my entire life. The formal reading of the will was scheduled for a Friday afternoon in November. Mr. Richardson's office was one of those old-fashioned lawyer offices with dark wood paneling and leather-bound books everywhere. Jessica arrived in her best power suit, ready to officially take over Dad's empire. I wore a simple black dress and carried a small purse that contained the cloth doll. I'd been carrying it everywhere since the funeral, finding comfort in its familiar weight. Also present were Dad's brother Uncle Mike, his longtime business partner Frank Kowalski, and Jessica's husband Brad. Everyone seemed to be in a celebratory mood, treating this more like a coronation than a legal proceeding. Brad had already been talking about the renovations he wanted to make to Dad's house, and Jessica had been dropping hints about expanding the business into commercial development. Mr. Richardson, a distinguished man in his 70s who'd been Dad's lawyer for over 20 years, cleared his throat and began reading from the official document. The last will and testament of Patrick Michael Mitchell, dated March 15th of this year. Most of the beginning was standard legal language. Dad left his personal effects to be divided among family members, made donations to several Irish-American charities, and set up a small scholarship fund at the local community college. Everyone nodded along politely, waiting for the main event. To my beloved daughter Jessica, Mr. Richardson continued, I leave my house at 247 Maple Street, along with all furnishings and personal items contained within, with the exception of the doll collection in the spare bedroom, which belongs to Sarah. Jessica smiled triumphantly and squeezed Brad's hand. This was going exactly as expected. And now we come to the business assets, Mr. Richardson said, flipping to a new page. Jessica sat up straighter, practically glowing with anticipation. Frank Kowalski nodded approvingly. He'd always gotten along well with Jessica and was looking forward to continuing their partnership. This is where it gets interesting, Mr. Richardson said, and something in his tone made me look up from my hands. Jessica launched into her prepared statement before he could continue. I want everyone to know that I'm committed to honoring Dad's legacy. I've already been working on plans to expand Mitchell and Associates. We're going to bid on some major municipal projects, maybe even look into commercial development. Dad always said the sky was the limit. She gestured grandly, already playing the part of the company president. I mean, it's obvious Dad was grooming me for this my entire life. I'm getting the house and the business. Sarah just gets the dolls, she laughed, and Brad chuckled along with her. Even Uncle Mike cracked a smile. Everyone in the room laughed except for Mr. Richardson and me. I felt something cold settle in my stomach, but I didn't know why. Mr. Richardson adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Jessica. Actually, Ms. Mitchell, there's something important you need to understand about the business structure. Jessica waved him off dismissively. Whatever the details are, we can work them out later. The important thing is that I'm inheriting Dad's company. That's just it, Mr. Richardson said carefully. You're not. The room went dead silent. Jessica's smile faltered. What do you mean? Mr. Richardson pulled out a separate folder and opened it. Your father restructured the ownership of Mitchell and Associates 18 months ago, in March of last year. While he maintained operational control as CEO and allowed you to continue in your management role, he transferred ownership to Sarah. The legal documents show that Sarah has been the official owner since March 2024, though your father retained full management authority through a comprehensive management agreement that expired upon his death. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Everyone was staring at me, but I couldn't process what I was hearing. That's impossible, Jessica said, her voice rising. I've been working there for 8 years. I manage the day-to-day operations. Dad always said I was going to inherit the business. Mr. Richardson nodded sympathetically. Your father did lead you to believe that, yes. But legally speaking, Sarah has been the owner of Mitchell and Associates Construction since March 2024. Your father maintained his position as CEO and granted you full operational authority through a detailed management agreement, but the actual ownership transferred to Sarah 18 months ago. Your father's management authority, and by extension, your operational authority, expired upon his death. The silence in the room was deafening. I could hear the clock on the wall ticking. But why? Jessica stammered. I don't understand. Sarah doesn't even work in construction. She lives in Chicago. She doesn't know anything about running a company. Mr. Richardson looked at me, and I saw something that might have been approval in his eyes. Perhaps Sarah would like to explain her father's reasoning. Everyone turned to look at me. Jessica's face was pale, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Brad looked like he was about to be sick. Frank Kowalski was staring at me like I'd suddenly grown a second head. And that's when I started laughing. I couldn't help it. The absurdity of the situation, the look on Jessica's face, the memory of all those Sunday conversations with Dad suddenly making perfect sense, it all hit me at once, and I just started laughing. Not a mean laugh, not a vindictive laugh, just genuine amusement at the cosmic joke of it all. Sarah, Jessica said, her voice dangerous now, what is going on? I wiped tears from my eyes and tried to compose myself. Dad told me about this 2 years ago. He made me promise not to say anything until after the will reading. Told you about what? Jessica demanded. I took a deep breath. About how you've been systematically making costly mistakes that Dad has been quietly covering up. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. That's not true, Jessica said, but her voice lacked conviction. I opened my purse and pulled out a small notebook, one of many I'd filled during those Sunday visits with Dad. The Henderson Project, 2019. You overspent the budget by $37,000 because you didn't properly calculate material costs. Dad covered it out of his personal savings. Jessica's face went white. The Morrison renovation, 2020? You missed the deadline by 3 weeks because you didn't account for the permit approval process. Dad had to pay penalty fees and nearly lost the client. How do you? Jessica started to ask. The EPA violation in early 2020, I continued, flipping through my notes. You authorized the disposal of construction waste without proper environmental clearance. The fine was $12,000, and Dad had to hire an environmental consultant to clean up the mess. Frank Kowalski was looking back and forth between Jessica and me like he was watching a tennis match. Patrick never told me about any of this. Of course he didn't, I said. He was protecting Jessica's reputation. But he was also protecting the company. He knew that if word got out about these mistakes, Mitchell and Associates would lose credibility in the industry. I closed the notebook and looked directly at my sister. Dad spent 18 months teaching me the business from the ground up during our Sunday visits. Every week, he'd bring financial statements, project reports, client communications. He'd walk me through every aspect of the company's operations. He said he needed to make sure I understood what I would be inheriting. Jessica was shaking now. This isn't fair. I've devoted my entire adult life to that company. And you've made expensive mistakes every single year, I replied. Dad loved you, Jessica, but he loved the company more. He built it from nothing, and he wasn't going to let it fail because of poor management decisions. Mr. Richardson cleared his throat. There are some additional provisions in the will that might interest everyone. Sarah, your father left you a detailed transition plan. He also arranged for Frank to continue as partner and operations manager, assuming you approve of the arrangement. Frank looked at me with new respect. You really know the business? I nodded. Dad made sure of it. I can recite the specifications for every project you've completed in the last 5 years. I know which suppliers offer the best prices, which subcontractors are reliable, which clients pay on time. I've been preparing for this for 18 months. But you live in Chicago, Brad said weakly. You have your own job. Had my own job, I corrected. I gave my notice 2 months ago. I've been planning to move back to take over the company. Jessica stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is insane. You can't just waltz in and steal my inheritance. I'm not stealing anything, I said calmly. Dad gave me ownership of the company 18 months ago. Legally, you've been working as his designated manager, operating under his authority. But that authority died with him. That's when Jessica completely lost it. This is ridiculous. She screamed. I'm contesting this will. There's no way Dad would leave the business to you. You played with dolls while I was learning about construction. You hid in Chicago while I was building relationships with clients. This is some kind of mistake. Mr. Richardson shook his head. I'm afraid there's no mistake, Jessica. Your father was very clear about his intentions. He even left a personal letter for you, explaining his decision. He handed Jessica an envelope with her name written in Dad's familiar handwriting. She tore it open with shaking hands and read the contents. As she read, her face went through a series of emotions: confusion, hurt, anger, and finally, devastation. What does it say? Brad asked softly. Jessica's voice was barely a whisper. He says he's proud of my enthusiasm and my people skills, but that I never learned to take responsibility for my mistakes. He says the business needs someone who understands that success comes from careful planning and attention to detail, not just charisma and good intentions. She looked up at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw my older sister as truly vulnerable. He says he hopes someday I'll understand that this decision wasn't about love, it was about legacy. The room was quiet for a long moment. I found myself feeling sorry for Jessica, despite everything. She really had believed she was Dad's chosen heir. The reality of the situation was clearly devastating for her. But then Brad opened his mouth and ruined any sympathy I might have felt. Well, this is just great, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. So much for the house renovations. So much for expanding the business. I guess we're back to living in our shitty apartment while Sarah gets to play CEO with Daddy's company. That's when my sympathy evaporated. Actually, Brad, I said, standing up and gathering my things, there's something else you should know. Jessica, do you remember the Riverside development project from last year? Jessica looked up, confused. What about it? The one where you approved the use of substandard materials to save money, even though Dad specifically told you not to? Jessica's face went pale again. How did you know about that? Because Dad told me. And because I've been reviewing all the company's projects for the past 3 years. I smiled, but it wasn't a nice smile. That building is going to need major structural repairs within the next 5 years. The materials you use don't meet the load-bearing requirements for a building that size. Frank Kowalski sat up straight. Are you saying we have a liability issue? I'm saying we're going to get sued, I replied. The question is whether it happens in 2 years or 5 years. But it's definitely going to happen. Jessica was shaking her head frantically. That's not possible. I followed all the building codes. The inspectors signed off on everything. You followed the minimum building codes, I corrected. But Dad's original specifications called for materials that exceeded those requirements because he knew the building would be used for heavy manufacturing equipment. When you substituted cheaper materials to increase profit margins, you created a safety hazard. I turned to Frank. Dad left detailed documentation about this issue. He was planning to quietly fix the problem before anyone noticed, but he died before he could implement the solution. How much is this going to cost? Frank asked, and I could see him mentally calculating the financial impact. Between the repairs and the legal settlements? Probably around $2 million. The number hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Jessica slumped back into her chair. I didn't know. I thought I was being smart, finding ways to increase profits. That's exactly the problem, I said. You made decisions without understanding the long-term consequences. Dad spent 30 years building a reputation for quality and safety. You nearly destroyed it in one project. Mr. Richardson was gathering his papers, clearly eager to end this increasingly uncomfortable meeting. Sarah, your father left you a comprehensive action plan for dealing with the Riverside situation. He also established a legal defense fund to cover the anticipated costs. I nodded. I've already been in touch with a structural engineer. We're going to proactively fix the problem before anyone gets hurt and before we get sued. It'll be expensive, but it's better than waiting for disaster to strike. Jessica looked at me with something that might have been respect. You really have been preparing for this. For 3 years, I confirmed. Every Sunday, Dad and I would spend hours going over the business. He taught me everything, not just the technical aspects, but the philosophy behind it. Quality work, fair prices, treating employees well, building relationships with clients based on trust rather than just profit. I picked up my purse and the cloth doll fell out. Jessica saw it and her expression softened slightly. You still carry that old thing around? I picked up the doll and held it carefully. Dad gave this to me when I was 13. It belonged to his mother in Ireland. He told me it represented the importance of holding on to what matters, even when everything else changes. I remember, Jessica said quietly. He used to tell us stories about his childhood in Dublin. For a moment, we were just two sisters remembering our father. Then Brad ruined the moment again. So what happens now? He demanded. Jessica's worked at that company for 8 years. Is Sarah just going to fire her? I looked at Jessica thoughtfully. Actually, I have a proposition. Everyone waited. Jessica, you know the day-to-day operations better than anyone. You understand the workflow, you know the employees, and despite your mistakes, you do have good relationships with most of our clients. I need someone to manage operations while I focus on the financial and strategic aspects of the business. Jessica looked up hopefully. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you the chance to learn how to run a business properly, I said. You'll report to me, and you'll do exactly what I tell you to do, when I tell you to do it. No more autonomous decision-making, no more shortcuts, no more trying to maximize profits at the expense of quality. But if you can prove that you've learned from your mistakes, maybe someday we can revisit the partnership structure. It wasn't a generous offer, and we both knew it. Jessica would go from thinking she was inheriting a company to working as a glorified manager for her younger sister. But it was better than being fired. Jessica looked at Brad, who was shaking his head frantically. Don't do it, he hissed. You're better than working for your little sister. We'll contest the will. We'll find a way to prove that the old man wasn't in his right mind when he changed the ownership. That's when Frank Kowalski spoke up. Actually, Brad, I was there when Patrick restructured the company. He was definitely in his right mind. In fact, he spent months planning every detail. He even had Sarah attend several board meetings via video call, though we were told she was just observing as part of a business education program. Brad's face turned red. This whole family is crazy. Jessica looked at her husband with something approaching disgust. Brad, shut up. Sarah's offering me a chance to stay involved with the business Dad built. That's more than I deserve after what I've learned today. She turned to me. What would my salary be? I had prepared for this question. $60,000 a year to start, with performance bonuses based on project success rates and client satisfaction. If you can go 2 full years without a major mistake, we'll discuss profit sharing. It was a significant pay cut from what Jessica had been making, but it was fair given the circumstances. Jessica took a deep breath. I accept. Brad exploded. Are you kidding me? You're going to work for your sister at a fraction of your current salary? We can't afford that. Then get a job, Jessica snapped. I've been supporting us for 3 years while you've been working on your novel. Maybe it's time for you to contribute something to this marriage besides criticism. I was starting to like this version of my sister better. Mr. Richardson cleared his throat one final time. If we're all in agreement, I have some paperwork for Sarah to sign to officially transfer control of the company. I also have keys to your father's house, Jessica, and the title transfer documents. As we signed papers and exchanged keys, I found myself thinking about Dad's Sunday visits in a new light. All those hours spent looking through antique shops, talking about business, sharing coffee and stories, he hadn't just been bonding with me. He'd been training me. The meeting finally ended around 6 p.m. Uncle Mike left first, muttering about how Patrick always did have a devious streak. Frank shook my hand and said he looked forward to working with me. Brad stormed out without saying goodbye to anyone. But before Jessica and I could leave, Mr. Richardson asked me to stay for a few additional minutes. He had more documents to review, he said, and some things that Dad had specifically requested he share with me privately. Jessica looked curious but didn't protest. "I'll wait in the car," she said quietly, and for the first time all day, she didn't sound angry or entitled. She just sounded tired. Once we were alone, Mr. Richardson pulled out another folder, this one much thicker than the others. "Your father left very detailed instructions about the transition," he said. He knew this day would be difficult for Jessica, and he wanted to make sure you had all the tools necessary to handle both the business challenges and the family dynamics. He opened the folder and spread out several documents. First, there's this. It was a complete financial analysis of Mitchell and Associates, going back 10 years. Every project, every profit margin, every expense was meticulously documented. But what caught my attention were Dad's handwritten notes in the margins. Jessica approved overtime without budget consultation. Dad personally covered $12,000 overrun. Jessica promised unrealistic completion date. Dad paid penalty fees to maintain client relationship. Jessica ordered premium materials unnecessarily. Dad absorbed $8,500 excess cost to preserve profit margins. Page after page of mistakes, all carefully documented, all quietly fixed by Dad without Jessica ever knowing the full extent of her errors. "Your father wasn't trying to sabotage Jessica," Mr. Richardson explained. He maintained full operational control and allowed Jessica to continue in her management role while he quietly corrected her mistakes. He was trying to protect the company while hoping she would eventually learn from experience. But as you can see, the pattern of costly errors never improved, even though he personally absorbed the financial consequences. I flipped through the pages, my stomach sinking with each new entry. She really had no idea how much damage she was causing. "None," Mr. Richardson confirmed. "Your father covered for her every single time. He told me once that he felt guilty about giving her responsibility she wasn't ready for, but he didn't know how to take it away without destroying her confidence completely." The next document was even more revealing. It was a detailed analysis of what would have happened to the company if Jessica had inherited it. "Your father had me run projections based on Jessica's decision-making patterns and the financial trends we observed," Mr. Richardson explained. Given her track record and the escalating costs of her mistakes, Mitchell and Associates would likely have faced serious financial difficulties within 3 to 5 years if these patterns continued unchecked. The Riverside project alone created potential liabilities that could have triggered a cascade of lawsuits and insurance claims. I stared at the numbers on the page. Dad hadn't just been protecting his legacy, he'd been protecting Jessica from herself. If she had inherited the company and continued making the same kinds of mistakes, she would have lost everything anyway, except it would have been a slow, humiliating slide into bankruptcy instead of the shock she'd experienced today. "There's something else," Mr. Richardson said, pulling out a sealed envelope with my name on it. "Your father wanted you to have this after you learned about your inheritance." I opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a letter in Dad's familiar handwriting. "My dearest Sarah," it began, "if you're reading this, then you know the truth about Mitchell and Associates. I hope you can forgive an old man for keeping such a big secret from you, but I needed to be sure you were ready for this responsibility. I've watched you build your own life without any help from me, and I've been prouder of you than you'll ever know. When you were struggling to pay for community college, working 3 jobs and still maintaining perfect grades, I wanted to help you so many times. But your mother reminded me that you needed to prove to yourself what you were capable of achieving. She was right, as she usually was. Watching you succeed on your own terms showed me that you had the discipline and the work ethic to handle something as complex as running a business. Jessica has many wonderful qualities, but she's never had to overcome real adversity. She doesn't understand that success requires sacrifice and careful planning, not just good intentions. The doll collection we built together represents more than just our Sunday afternoons, though those times were precious to me. Each doll taught us about history, about craftsmanship, about the value of things that others might overlook. I hope you see the parallel to what I'm asking you to do with the company. Mitchell and Associates might look like just another construction business to outsiders, but it represents 30 years of my life's work. Every relationship with every client, every reputation for quality and reliability, every employee who depends on us for their livelihood, these are precious things that require careful stewardship. I know you're probably feeling overwhelmed right now. I know Jessica is hurt and confused. I know this isn't the inheritance either of you expected. But I believe in my heart that this is the right decision, not just for the company, but for both of my daughters. Jessica needs to learn that leadership isn't about being in charge, it's about being responsible for outcomes. Maybe working under proper guidance will teach her the lessons I couldn't. And you need to learn that you're stronger and more capable than you've ever given yourself credit for. I've left you detailed transition plans, financial projections, and contact information for all our key clients and suppliers. Frank Kowalski is a good man who will support you through this transition. But remember, sweetheart, you already know everything you need to know. I made sure of that during our Sunday visits. Be patient with your sister. She's going to need time to process all of this. But also be firm in your decisions. The company's survival depends on having strong leadership, and you are stronger than you know. I love you both more than words can express. Take care of each other, and take care of the business we built together. Your proud father, Patrick Michael Mitchell. I was crying by the time I finished reading. Mr. Richardson quietly handed me a box of tissues and waited while I composed myself. He really planned all of this, I said finally. For 18 months, Mr. Richardson confirmed. Every legal document, every business strategy, every family consideration. Your father was many things, but he was never impulsive. This decision was made with careful thought and extensive planning. He pulled out one more document. There's also this. Your father established a trust fund for Jessica's future children, if she ever has any, to ensure their education is paid for. He also set aside money for her to pursue advanced management training or executive education programs if she chooses to develop her business skills further. I looked up in surprise. He thought of everything. He did. Your father loved Jessica very much, but he loved her enough to give her the chance to learn and grow, even if it meant she had to experience some difficult truths about herself first. Mr. Richardson began gathering the documents. Sarah, I've been practicing law for 45 years, and I've seen a lot of family businesses destroyed by poor succession planning. Your father's approach was unconventional, but I believe it was wise. You have the skills and the temperament to preserve his legacy, and Jessica has the opportunity to earn her place in the company through merit rather than assumption. I thought about Jessica sitting in the car, probably replaying every conversation she'd ever had with Dad, wondering how she'd missed all the signs that pointed to this outcome. Mr. Richardson, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think Jessica will be able to handle working for me? Really, honestly? He considered the question carefully. I think Jessica has more potential than she's ever been allowed to develop. Your father protected her from consequences, which meant she never learned to be truly careful with her decisions. But she's not stupid, and she's not malicious. With proper guidance and real accountability, she might surprise you. And if she can't handle it? Then you'll make the hard decisions necessary to protect the company. That's what leaders do. I gathered all the documents and put them in my briefcase. As we prepared to leave, Mr. Richardson had one final piece of advice. Sarah, your father asked me to tell you something specific. He said, remind Sarah that every doll in her collection was chosen with care and purpose. Some were valuable from the moment we found them, others gained value over time, and a few surprised us with their worth. The same is true of people. Jessica may surprise us all. I smiled through fresh tears. Even from beyond the grave, Dad was still teaching me lessons. When I finally made it to the parking lot, I found Jessica sitting in her car with the engine running, staring straight ahead. I tapped on her window, and she rolled it down. Everything okay? She asked, though she clearly wasn't okay herself. Dad left some additional instructions, I said. Would you like to get coffee somewhere and talk about what happens next? Jessica looked surprised. After the day we both had, a friendly coffee invitation was probably the last thing she'd expected. I'd like that, she said quietly. We drove to a small diner about 10 minutes from the law office, the kind of place Dad would have chosen, unpretentious, comfortable, and with good coffee. We sat across from each other in a booth by the window, and for a few minutes, we just sat in silence. Sarah, Jessica said finally, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. I nodded. Do you hate me? The question caught me off guard. What? No, Jessica, I don't hate you. But I've been so awful to you our entire lives. I always got everything I wanted, and I never even noticed how unfair it was. I made fun of your doll collection, I dismissed your career, I assumed Dad would leave me everything because I never imagined he might value what you brought to the table. She was crying now, ugly tears that made her mascara run. I've been such a terrible sister. I reached across the table and took her hand. Jessica, you weren't terrible. You were just privileged. Dad gave you advantages that he didn't give me, but that wasn't your fault. You didn't choose to be born first, and you didn't choose to be Dad's golden child. But I could have chosen to be kinder to you. I could have chosen to notice when you were struggling. I could have chosen to include you instead of treating you like an annoying little sister who didn't matter. I squeezed her hand. That's all in the past now. What matters is what we do going forward. Jessica wiped her eyes with a napkin. Sarah, I meant what I said in the lawyer's office. I want to earn my place in the company. I want to prove that I can be the employee you need, and maybe someday, the partner Dad thought I could become. But I need you to know that I understand how much I have to learn. What about Brad? I asked. He seemed pretty upset about the change in your financial situation. Jessica's expression hardened. Brad can figure out his own life. I've been supporting him for 3 years while he's been pretending to write a novel. The truth is, he hasn't written a single page. He just likes the idea of being married to someone with money and status. She took a sip of her coffee and looked out the window. You know what the worst part is? When the lawyer was reading the will today, Brad wasn't concerned about how I was feeling or what this meant for my relationship with Dad's memory. All he cared about was how it would affect our lifestyle. That told me everything I needed to know about my marriage. I was quiet for a moment, processing this revelation. Are you sure you want to make such a big decision so quickly? Divorce is a huge step. I've been thinking about it for months, Jessica admitted. Today just clarified things for me. I want to be someone who earns respect through hard work and integrity, not someone who expects things to be handed to them because of who they married or who their father was. We talked for another hour, covering everything from Dad's Sunday visits to Jessica's mistakes at the company to our childhood memories. For the first time in our adult lives, we had a real conversation, honest, vulnerable, and without the undercurrent of competition that had always existed between us. As we prepared to leave, Jessica had one more question. Sarah, what made Dad choose you? I mean, really, what do you think was the deciding factor? I thought about Dad's letter, still folded in my purse. I think it was because I never expected him to save me. When I was struggling in college, I never asked him for money. When I was building my career, I never asked him for connections or opportunities. I think he saw that I was willing to fail on my own terms rather than succeed through his intervention. Jessica nodded slowly. And I always expected him to fix my problems. You were the firstborn daughter of a successful businessman, I said gently. Of course you expected him to take care of you. But Dad needed to know that the company would be left with someone who understood that success has to be earned, not inherited. As we walked back to our cars, Jessica stopped and turned to me. Sarah, I have a confession to make. I waited. I always envied your doll collection. I laughed, surprised. Really? Really? Not the dolls themselves, but the way Dad's face would light up when he talked about your Sunday trips to antique shops. He would come home and tell Mom about some amazing find you'd made, or some historical fact you taught him about a particular doll. He was so proud of your knowledge and your passion. She kicked at a small stone in the parking lot. I always thought he just felt sorry for you because you were the quiet, awkward daughter. But now I realize he was proud of you because you had developed expertise in something that mattered to you. You weren't just collecting dolls, you were studying history, learning about craftsmanship, understanding value and authenticity. Jessica. No, let me finish. I never developed that kind of deep knowledge about anything. I was always focused on being popular, being pretty, being charming. But I never took the time to become truly good at anything. Even at the company, I relied on charm and Dad's reputation instead of developing real skills. She looked me in the eyes. That's going to change. I'm going to become the kind of employee you can count on, and the kind of person Dad would be proud of. As I drove back to my hotel that night, I realized that the day had been transformative for both of us. I had learned that I was stronger and more prepared than I'd ever imagined. And Jessica had learned that she had more growing to do than she'd ever realized. But maybe, just maybe, we had both learned that being sisters didn't have to mean being competitors. I owe you an apology, she said suddenly. For what? For treating you like the little sister who never amounted to anything. For assuming Dad would leave everything to me just because I was older and more visible. For not realizing that your Sunday visits meant something important. I considered her apology. Jessica, do you know why Dad really restructured the company? She shook her head. It wasn't just because of your mistakes. It was because he saw how hard I worked to put myself through school, how I built a career from nothing, how I never asked him for help even when things were difficult. He told me once that watching me struggle and succeed on my own terms reminded him of his own journey coming to America with nothing. Jessica was quiet for a moment. I never thought about it that way. Dad loved both of us, I continued. But he knew that I understood the value of hard work in a way that you never had to learn. You've been given everything your whole life, not because Dad didn't love me, but because you were the firstborn and he wanted to give you every advantage. But advantages without struggle don't always create strong character. Is that why you think I made so many mistakes? I nodded. You never learned to be afraid of failure because Dad always fixed your problems. I learned to be careful because I knew nobody was going to bail me out. We stood there in the parking lot, two sisters finally understanding each other for the first time in decades. Sarah, Jessica said finally, I want you to know that I'm going to work harder than I've ever worked in my life. I'm going to prove that I can be the employee you need, and maybe someday, the partner Dad thought I could become. I smiled at her, and for the first time, it was genuine. I'm counting on it. Mitchell and Associates needs both of us to succeed. As I drove back to my hotel that night, I thought about the doll collection I'd inherited, hundreds of antique dolls that Dad and I had collected over the years. Jessica and everyone else saw them as toys, as something frivolous and childish. But Dad and I knew better. Those dolls were investments, each one carefully researched and purchased. Some were worth hundreds of dollars, others thousands. A few rare pieces were worth tens of thousands. All told, My worthless doll collection was valued at just over $800,000, though I kept the most valuable pieces in a climate-controlled storage facility with proper insurance and security, bringing only my personal favorites to display in my apartment. I started laughing again, just like I had in the lawyer's office. Dad's sense of humor was even more wicked than I'd realized. He'd let everyone think he was giving me the consolation prize while secretly making me a millionaire. But the real prize wasn't the money or even the company. It was finally understanding that Dad had seen my worth all along, even when I couldn't see it myself.